Hello, and welcome to this panel session on pandemic preparedness, lessons learned from COVID-19. I'm Joseph Derisi. I'm a professor in biochemistry and biophysics at the University of California, San Francisco, and I'm the co-president of the Chan Zuckerberg BioHub. And I'm here today with an excellent group of panelists and my co-host, Anne Wojcicki.
Hi, Joe. So great to be here. I am Anne Wojcicki. I am the co-founder and CEO of 23andMe. And I am honored to be able to be co-hosting this panel on pandemic preparedness, lessons learned from COVID-19. And we have a really fabulous group of guests here. So let me just quickly introduce, and then we will kick it off, and I'll let Joe start the first question. So we have Amy Abernathy, who is the Principal Deputy Commissioner at the FDA, Michael Drake, President of the University of California, Sam Hawgood, UCSF Chancellor, Mark McClellan, Professor of Business Medicine and Health Policy at Duke, and Jeff Shuren, Director of the Centers for Device and Radiological Health at the FDA. And with that, let me kick it back to you, Joe, and we'll kick off.
Great. What a fabulous panel. Thank you all for being here today. So while the title of this panel is Lessons Learned from COVID-19, which, effectively is a retrospective, I think Anne and I would really like to begin this panel with a little something more forward-looking too. And that is, with respect to the current state of the pandemic, which we don't need to reiterate here, it's horrible, what is the single most important issue we now face as a nation? In other words, for each panelist, I'd love to hear what really keeps you up at night and what do you think we can do about it? Let's have each panelist take about 3 or 4 minutes to answer this question, and I'll pass the baton first to Dr. Drake.
Well, thank you, Joe. A great question. I have to approach it with, what part of the night do you mean? I mean, there's the what keeps me from going to sleep, but then what wakes me up in the middle and whatever else, because there's so many aspects of this that are troubling. The first part, I guess, though, if I were to start, I had one of our colleagues, many of us worked with a man named Lloyd Holly Smith at UCSF for many years, a professor of mine and a mentor. And I know once we were walking and I was in the process of searching for a dean, and we were just chatting, and he kind of pat me on the shoulder and he said something I've quoted 1,000 times since, which is that he said the difference between A and A+ is huge. And that's always stuck with me, is that there's a great difference between A and A+, and then he kind of faded off beautifully after that wisdom, as normally would. And I think there's also the other part of that they didn't say is that the difference between A and F is huge as well. And I think what we've had as a national response would be categorized fairly as an F. We've really failed to have an organized national policy to be able to coordinate the states, and the states have had a terrible time coordinating their counties. So the thing that worries me most, I'm expecting all of us are heartened by the presence of the vaccines that we have, that we are now distributing, and the fact that more are on the horizon, some that are promising. The prospect of getting those vaccines into the arms of the people that need them is still, we've seen how difficult it's been to roll that out effectively. And I say that the rollout of the vaccine is also going to be a challenge. At the very beginning, when we have the 1A group, when we're looking at those healthcare workers and providers who are kind of exposed to viral particles in their normal work and help to keep us safe, that's an easy group to kind of isolate and focus on. And I think we're doing a reasonable job, at least, of approaching them. But then we start getting to this broad category of essential workers and the elderly, and a whole series of groups that are going to be very difficult, I think, to prioritize fairly. So I worry about that. I worry about the beginning of the line moving smoothly, and then as the line gets wider and wider and people are crowding more and more to try to get through that passageway, that we have chaos and social disruption of a variety of types. And I worry in that we are effective in the way that we deploy our vaccine, the way we transmit vaccines to people in communities that are vulnerable. The underserved tend to be the under-resourced, and they tend, as we've seen in so many aspects of this, they tend to be the ones that bear the brunt of the effects of the pandemic, either economically or health status-wise, or all kinds of other ways that those communities have been more affected. but they tend to have the least political power, et cetera, and so would have the most difficult time assuring their appropriate priority in the line of getting vaccine, a challenge there. And then a challenge on acceptance. One of the most disheartening parts of the last year for me have been the mixed messages that we've been getting from sources that we had learned to rely on for our careers, for our lives. We have very confusing messages, and I think this has tended to really destroy the faith and trust that people have in the broad directives that they would be getting from the government and other sources. And how do we get over those hurdles of communication? So if that's one thing, Joe, if that's the one thing, it's the getting from here to there in a smooth and efficient fashion worries me. Last asterisk, and the asterisk is the race we have now against new variants, against mutations, against whatever resistance would look like. That the longer this takes, the more that concerns me as well.
That rings true, Dr. Drake, especially your comments about Holly Smith. I had the privilege of knowing him for a short time. Let's pass the baton to Amy Abernathy. Dr. Abernathy?
Thank you. So I think Dr. Drake's comments really ring true to me as well. And we heard from Peter Marks before about his concerns around escape variants. I think I would highlight that my concern that keeps me up at night is exhaustion as a nation, maybe even exhaustion as a world. We need the ability to keep going even when, honestly, it might get worse. We hope it won't get worse, but it might. And, what to do about that. So I think that without going too much further, I can just say full stop. You're going to absolutely need leadership to help us keep going. And we're going to need leadership that really convenes us with both a sense of here's what we need to do together as a nation and the hope and optimism to actually be able to get it done. Because one of the things that we know about Americans is that we respond to hope. And I think that that's going to be important, in this landscape going forward. I would also say that we need, as a part of that leadership, the importance on building what we've on top of what we've learned thus far. Some practical examples looking across the United States government right now is the importance of being able to have data on which we can rely to describe the pandemic, to respond to the pandemic, to make sense and figure out how to go forward. And how do we do that? Whether we continue to build on HHS Protect, which is a system built by Health and Human Services, connecting CDC and FDA or others. And we also need to learn as it relates to the science. And I think that we'll continue to talk about that. So I don't need to say more, but this whole meeting is around the regulatory science and learning from the science. And we need to learn from how do we best communicate. So, the public, they want to know that we have their back. And so that is a combination of here's what we think is the smartest thing for you as an American, as a part of the public to do right now, but we're going to keep learning and we're going to keep making sure that you're as up to date as the information that we have right now. So that gives us space to also acknowledge we're not going to always have it right, and that's going to keep changing. And so the last thing I'd say, and goes along with what Dr. Blake just said, is we actually need to be able to connect local solutions that work within communities with also national solutions. And so I really think that if we're not careful, we will be exhausted as a nation, but if we're thoughtful and hopeful, we'll actually be able to keep moving forward, even if it does get harder in the future, and then hopefully it won't.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let's pass the baton to Chancellor Hawgood.
Thank you, Joe. And I'll pick up on themes that have already been brought up because they definitely keep me up at night. And then I'd like to introduce just one other. I think this issue of consistency of messaging is absolutely critical, and I think leads to some of the exhaustion that we're seeing in society when messages change. When messages coming out of Washington are different to messages coming out of Sacramento and are different coming out of every county in the state, it's confusing to people. And rather than try to understand it or accept the fact that we're in a rapidly moving situation so that some communication issues are likely, it just leads to fatigue, I think. And so I'm very concerned about getting to a consistent message as quickly as we can and then sticking with it so we can stay, as a leader of a health system right now, in the midst of trying to roll out vaccinations, we're meeting daily and trying to interpret policy that seems to be changing on a minute-to-minute basis, and we just have to settle on something and stick with it. The new theme that I would introduce that is creeping up on my list of what keeps me up at night is what is the chronicity of this disease. I initially interpreted it as a really bad viral disease, but for the most part, if you recovered, you would recover. And I think there's increasing evidence that there's a lot of biology and pathology that we don't yet understand around these so-called long haulers, or people that have really protracted, severe symptoms. Some of them neurologic, but mostly the fatigue and weakness that seems to be far more common than in most other acute viral syndromes. So the long-term health consequences are increasingly causing me concern as to both what's behind that from a biology perspective and what are we going to do about it as a health provider perspective.
That's very interesting. Yes, we don't often talk about the chronic consequences of having COVID. Let's move to Dr. Mcclellan.
Joe, great to be with you and the rest of this distinguished group. And there certainly are a lot of things that could be keeping people up at night. What I want to highlight is probably most important at this point, when not only are cases surging, but they are going to get worse, is progress on vaccination. And I'm not sure I'd agree that this has been, the vaccination has been an F. There's a lot of areas for improvement overall, no question. But if you think about what's critical for dealing with a pandemic at this scale, some of these steps have occurred with remarkable pace in vaccination development. I wish we had the same kind of approach in other key parts of our pandemic response. So in terms of early clinical development and testing, we identified a number of lead candidates fast. Human testing with the first vaccines had begun within a couple of months of identifying the virus, and large-scale trials got underway not so much longer after that. It's really remarkable that we're now in the first pandemic in the era of true synthetic biology, what can happen in terms of pandemic response. And not only was the early clinical testing done quickly, large-scale platform trials for the vaccines to answer definitive questions that we don't even get to answer for many vaccines that have been fully approved about their large-scale effects on outcomes that matter, and large-scale safety studies were done remarkably fast. 40,000 people enrolled, particularly in areas that were hard hit and involving populations that were most affected, not just the typical, healthy people without much minority or other diverse representation. We did that well. We also did manufacturing in advance at large scale. Maybe it could have been or should have been even larger, but all that meant that within hours to days of approving the vaccines with very good evidence, we were able to start the distribution of vaccines at a large scale. And that distribution system, the federal part of the logistics, actually works pretty well to get vaccines out to where they're needed. Where we're seeing big challenges, though, as has already been alluded to, is in the state's ability to respond and act on vaccine availability quickly, to close this very big gap that's emerged between the doses approved and the doses that are actually being taken up. And that involves a lot of education and outreach work that has been underdeveloped. It involves a lot of guidance, technical guidance and support for states and local governments that are on the front lines of the localized response and use of the pandemic that's been underdeveloped. Congress finally passed legislation at the end, and President Trump signed at the end of December, that will provide some needed financial help for the states in overseeing these efforts, but still not a whole lot of technical guidance and the like there. That is going to change to some extent with the new administration. You've probably seen their announcements this past week about highlighting the development of mass vaccination sites around the country, which will help close that gap between the people out there who want to get vaccinated, and the large availability of vaccines that we have now, the further steps towards increasing supply could potentially help more with that. But what that's not going to do, back to Michael's point, is that it's not going to deal with the disparities that we've seen in every phase of this pandemic, and they're probably going to be aggravated. A lot of people are going to be willing to go to a football stadium and get their vaccine. A lot of people over 65 and other risk groups. But with still much of the country having hesitancy around vaccines, we've seen it recently in nursing home workers, for example, and many people not necessarily having an easy path and confidence to go to a mass vaccination event like that. We really are going to have to pay a lot more attention to reaching all segments of our population, rural populations, lower income, minority, those who are probably not going to be able to stand in line at the football stadium or wherever at one of these mass events. So I think we're going to pick up the pace on getting more people vaccinated. That's great for helping to control outbreaks. We are in danger, though, of repeating the same problems of disparities in response and disparities in impact that we've seen in other aspects. So I hope we're going to pay a lot more attention to public engagement around this and help technical assistance for the states. But I wish we'd seen the kinds of steps we did see in other parts of the vaccine response in areas like testing or in areas like therapeutics development, where we never really got going with those kind of large scale platform trials. If you look at the monoclonal antibodies, for example, have been approved for or authorized for emergency use by the FDA. Those were authorized based on just a handful, a couple of dozen events, and so there's been questions and doubts about the quality of that evidence and real problems in setting up access as well. And there, I think we could learn some lessons from what we did from vaccinations, and hopefully across the board do a better job of this federal state coordination and technical support for going the last mile and having an impact on the very tough surge that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, those comments are spot on. I couldn't agree more. And while it feels slow to many of us who are waiting to get the vaccine, myself included, the unprecedented rate at which its vaccines were developed and tested is truly staggering, and that should not go without notice. Finally, let's pass the baton to Dr. Shuren.
Well, I would say if there was only one thing that kept me up at night, I would probably be the best night's sleep I've gotten in a long time. Putting a nickel down, probably top on the list, as you've heard from others, it's vaccines, and making sure the distributor, they're being used, people are going and they're getting vaccinated. We have a lot of doses that are out there and that, they haven't been used yet. More's on the way. And my concern is they're just not going to get used by people as quickly as they otherwise would. And I think one of the big challenges behind this, it's trust. I mean, the American public, so many people have lost trust in the response at every single level. And as a result, when you come out and you tell people what to do, there's a lot of hesitancy, and that's going to make not just vaccinating, but really trying to get on top of, and I won't say a permanent end, but really getting a handle on this pandemic, so much more challenging. Hopefully, things will get under control, but as you heard, Sam had said, there's so much uncertainty. We just don't know what's going to happen down the road. All the people who have been affected may have long-term effects, and we don't know with the race against time that we will see mutations that, quite frankly, we end up in a circumstance where we're dealing with annual vaccinations for the latest version on SARS-CoV-2, and it's not truly a one and done, but something that stays with us a long, long time.
That's great. Anne, do you what would you like to launch the next question, or should I riff off of those comments?
It just, Dr. Shuren, everything that you just said there, in some ways, like that's what really keeps me up at night here, is thinking about the idea of annual vaccinations is terrifying, and the race with the mutation. So leading on to that, I think about what is it that we are going to do to stay vigilant. So we think about, the lack of, viral sequencing that's going on right now, or even when we do go back and we think about what got us into this place, to begin with, what is it that we could do, especially, being in the Silicon Valley with technology. How do we actually start to think about, building the right type of system to be really prepared for the next time? And how are we going to be able to keep track so that we can know whether or not are we entering the world where we're going to have annual vaccinations?
Who would like to take a shot at that first question?
Well, I think
I have a couple of comments. I mean, I do think, as you've already heard, and Joe could probably answer this one better than just about any of us. The mutations are real. The virus has had a chance to spread around the world without a whole lot of effective countermeasures yet. And with the vaccines rolling out, hopefully more use of effective monoclonals, there's going to be even more mutation pressure for alternatives to emerge. And I think it does mean some regulatory policy changes as well. So for our current vaccines and to some extent for the therapeutics, we've required kind of large scale outcome studies, or we certainly desired them. That may not be feasible if there are continued mutations, especially for products like monoclonals that may only have one, or if they're used in combination, a few specific targets. Important to try to make those targets parts of the virus that are preserved and not so likely to change. And it may mean that the regulatory structure here needs to be more like what we have with flu vaccines every year, where they're not large scale. We know the platform, we know the technology very well, so it's enough to have confidence for broad public use to do the in vitro studies of the immunogenicity of the vaccine, safety studies to make sure no safety issues, and then updating along with that. It does mean along with that need to have a sort of public awareness that this is not a one and done pandemic, that this is a war that's going to go on for quite some time with the virus and is going to require surveillance into the future. I know many of you all are thinking about these issues as well. Scott Gottlieb and I have an op-ed coming out later today on this exact topic and the need for kind of continued regulatory and public policy vigilance.
Sam, I think you had a comment there.
I was just, broadening the concept beyond COVID and do probably what I'm not meant to do and turn the table from being a panelist to ask you to comment, Joe, because I know that you've thought a lot about surveillance for zoonotic disease and what do we need to put in place. Amy mentioned the PREDICT program from the NIH that was dismantled a couple of years ago, but maybe rebuilt now. What are the effective international surveillance programs that we need to put in place? And then how do we perhaps think proactively in linking those surveillance programs with the synthetic biology approach to vaccines that's been commented on, how kind of you could modularize that and almost preemptively have vaccine available for likely candidates. But you know more about that than me for sure. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, I wasn't meant to be a panelist, but I'll make a brief comment, and that is, we currently lack a national surveillance plan and funding mechanisms to effectively use sequencing and genomics to surveil for not only new variants, like was detected in the UK with their excellent surveillance program, but also vaccine escape mutants, as was just discussed a few minutes ago, and we really need that. Here in California, our organization, the BioHub, we do a lot of sequencing. We are about 45% of the sequences sequenced in California. However, it's really a very tiny number, and we're doing it just kind of a one-off. We actually need an organized national plan to be able to do this, and I think it would reap dividends far beyond what we can expect just with this local variant. And those systems and molecular networks should be put in place for worldwide surveillance as well, to detect emerging and new or emerging pathogens globally, especially in low and middle income countries, for which infectious disease burdens tend to be the heaviest. We go on and on about that, and I don't want to steal anything from this panel. So Dr. Abernathy, I saw you had your hand up. Did you have a comment on the same topic?
Sure, I'll build on what you were just saying, though, Joe, and that's that. As we think about potentially preparing for a world where we may need yearly vaccines, one of the things that is striking is that we need to have learned from this year, and we need to be very judicious and thoughtful about how we learn to use and build on our evidence development systems. There's been a lot of conversation across the day-to-day about not being able to rely on, for example, real-world evidence, or not having a clear national system that's efficient with respect to clinical trials. And we need to be developing that science now to make sure that we're prepared to learn about vaccine effectiveness quickly as we need to develop additional vaccines in the future, including for subpopulations. One of the other things I was going to mention is there's been a program run through the Reagan-Udall Foundation with participation from FDA and many others, really looking at how do we build a community of evidence generation scientists to figure out how to learn from each other quickly in service of advancing clinical knowledge in the context of COVID-19. And what we've learned from that is that it's really important to get together data holders, new clinical trialists, new data researchers and data scientists from many different areas, including from both the biostatistics and epidemiology spaces, as well as artificial intelligence, to learn from each other to figure out how to make this science move forward quickly. And it strikes me that we need to really leverage these kinds of approaches in developing our evidence generation capabilities to go along with the potential need to have, for example, yearly vaccines in response to changes in SARS-CoV-2.
And Joe, maybe I have a comment too, just following Amy's comments about what we need to do, just as another lens, perhaps to take on this. I was in a conversation earlier this year and with one of our elected officials, and what we were talking about, what I was talking about was the national defense as a topic, and to think about, gosh, how much time and money and effort did we spend on the national defense in that circumstance, to protect the lives and health of Americans, to protect our economy, et cetera. And it's obviously hundreds of billions of dollars a year. But I was saying, if you want to look at the real threats to the lives and health of Americans, or the threats to our economy, this is an invader that's really done us massive damage. We all think back about the horrors, at least I do, forgive me for speaking for everyone, but the horrors of the Civil War, and how, my goodness gracious, 500,000 people died in that one conflict over that period of 4 years. So that many people are going to die from this in a year. And so it's really a horrific, it's been a horrific challenge to the country. And I would think that our defense of our public health needs to be looked at in reference to the way that we defend ourselves against tanks and planes from foreign invaders that have not proved to be this level of risk to us in modern times.
Dr. Drake, that's an excellent point. And actually, I think, this pandemic, as you point out, has, I think, laid bare what we would regard now as a gross inefficiency of our public health systems, whether that be the design of county level jurisdictions that don't agree with each other, or lack of communication, lack of data systems that are interoperable, et cetera. That isn't a system I think that the military would approve of, for example. So I put it to the panel, what are the key lessons learned that we can use now to improve the health for all Americans going forward from this pandemic? Big question, but who'd like to take the first shot?
No, Joe, I'll take a first shot. And one of the lessons that I've learned here is a lot of the conversation around public health policy in the country has focused on the payer. Should we have Medicare for all? Should we have insurance for all? But one of the lessons I've learned is the incredible inefficiencies between having many isolated and unlinked provider networks and health systems. In the early days, as you well know, going back to February and March, the story was around PPE. So, an organization like the University of California has so many relationships that we could tap into to help us break through supply chain problems. But hospitals only 20 miles from here didn't have those kind of resources. And how are we going to rethink how the providers work together? And I think it's a role that academic health systems can and should play, and sort of in a hub and spoke model where the academic health systems across the country, with all of their resources, whether it's the research, the manpower, the heft that we have, how do we partner with a network of rural hospitals and others to be a resource at a time like this? And right now we're dealing with pandemic. The same thing played out with testing. The same thing's now playing out with vaccines. How can we better organize ourselves as a provider system to address this? And it happens to be a pandemic now, but it could be a consequence of climate change, such as fires or earthquakes, etc., where everyone is left on their own to struggle. And I'm seeing that even down in LA at the moment. There are some hospitals that are completely overwhelmed, and there are others that are managing pretty well. And how do we move from a system where everyone's on their own boat to a system that's much more coordinated? And I think academic health systems can play and should play a major role in taking the leadership across the country and thinking about that problem.
Others on the panel, thoughts on that? Amy?
I'll go next. The National Academy has developed a group of what they're calling sectoral analyses of lessons learned from the pandemic. They're supposed to come out in the next couple of weeks. And I'm responsible for digital medicine together with Peter Lee from Microsoft. And as we've been reflecting on what have we learned from the pandemic and what is this teaching us about healthcare, first of all, innovation in healthcare is hard, especially because of the fact that we live in a regulated space, and practically speaking, when we're in the middle of a crisis, responding to the crisis is not really about perfection, which gives us this space to innovate and learn. And in the digital health space, I think everybody is really seeing the rise of telemedicine as the key kind of output. But what do we learn about telemedicine? Well, the infrastructure and the capabilities of telemedicine were largely there, but it wasn't until the Office of Civil Rights said that they were going to put forth enforcement discretion did we actually see the ability to have telemedicine move forward as quickly as it did, as well as then, for example, reimbursement through CMS and flexibilities as it related to licensing. So we see what's possible with respect to innovation across healthcare, but we also saw something else in all these sectoral analyses, and that's that every single part of our healthcare system has said one of our problems has been around the availability of data to be able to help us understand the pandemic, respond to the pandemic, and figure out how to move forward, as I mentioned before. Somebody has called it data everywhere, me without a drop to drink, recognizing that we really were kind of stuck. And what we're seeing now as we put this story together is that we do really have the opportunity to imagine having responded to the pandemic as if we were building a learning healthcare system, but we've had a number of pieces that we're missing. First of all, the ability to have interoperable data. We need to be able to think about what that might look like in the future. We need to be able to match the right analytic task to the right analytic approach. And it's not just being able to say, if we just had a push button and a lot of AI, everything is going to be solved. And that's going to be a really important thing for us to learn and advance within the context of the learning healthcare system. We certainly need to understand incentives, as Sam was just talking about. And we need to ultimately be able to build the trust infrastructure. And the last thing I would say is that within the context of digital medicine and digital health, we can't talk about digital health in the United States without not speaking about cybersecurity and what's been going on from that perspective. And I think something that's happening within the context of the pandemic is that we have another attack happening simultaneously that also increases the chance that we're at risk of eroding trust if we're not careful. And so recognizing trust is so important, and we have to have our systems in place to maintain trust is really critical. And so I think we've learned a lot in the pandemic about how we can make this better going forward, but we really have to pay attention to the details.
Excellent. Dr. Mcclellan or Dr. Shuren, any comments on that?
Well, I maybe I can actually help tee up Jeff a little bit. I think he's got some really good ideas on better approaches to testing that we've learned from this experience. And I couldn't agree more with the other panelists that have highlighted how tough it is if you're a frontline health provider to get the supports that you need and to do it in a coordinated way. One reason, though, that is so challenging is that we've done such a bad job in this country of kind of moving upstream, I guess you could say, in terms of pandemic containment. So between a very weak public health infrastructure and some decisions or approaches I'm sure we'd like to do differently if we had a chance to do it over again. We are facing these really high levels of caseloads, and that makes it just hard to control and manage. What could have gone better? Well, on the testing side, and I appreciate Jeff's comments on this. I mean, I've certainly learned a lot from hearing from him during the course of this pandemic. We were behind at the beginning in terms of getting diagnostic tests out. We knew how to diagnose a lot of unmeasured spread in the U.S. that really helped create complications for containment that are still with us. We still haven't manufactured tests at the level that we could. An approach there, like we've done for vaccines, I think still would be very effective. The availability of testing is way up from what it was last year. But we probably don't have a coordinated strategy in place yet to get both point of care rapid tests and effective use of PCR lab testing and all the places that it could make a difference for screening and surveillance and help with better containment and reopening. If we had picked, say, 5 or 6 really good manufacturers early on, went in jointly with them on large scale manufacturing with hard evidence backing up not only how accurate those tests were in people with symptoms, but also in asymptomatic populations, and strategies for using those tests as part of regular ongoing surveillance, I think we'd be in a lot different place than we are now. And hopefully we can keep building up our testing capacity to get there. People don't have enough access to therapeutics. Same thing. As Amy said, we've got tons of data, but very little evidence on what works. Number one supplier of COVID cases on the planet, and I'd say you all would know better than I do, but it's a tiny fraction of 1% of those patients who have been enrolled in any kind of meaningful clinical trial. There's been a lot of talk about applying the Defense Production Act. One could think about actually applying it to our research infrastructure. Staff at FDA have had to spend a lot of time reviewing INDs for literally thousands of COVID studies that probably aren't going to amount to anything. There's another event coming up on Wednesday that the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative is putting on. It's released some new data on that. Again, if we focus on a more limited number of platform trials that were easier to enroll, kind of the approach that Laura Esserman's taking, I think we know a lot more about therapeutics than we do now. We wouldn't be in a position like we are with monoclonals, where I personally think that the collective evidence there is quite good, but the NIH and IDSA judgments is that the evidence is marginal at best. And we also didn't have large-scale manufacturing in advance for those kinds of therapeutics that could have also helped reduce some of the burdens that healthcare providers are facing now. The last thing I'd like to emphasize, I think we are going to see changes in this direction with telehealth and so forth. There are some health systems out there that are doing a really good job of basically doing more public health prevention-oriented types of approaches to healthcare. They're typically not paid fee for service. They're more capitated or accountable care organizations or accountable health plans. Those plans for their patients today, their beneficiaries today, or for those providers, their primary care patient population today, they know who all of them are. They're tracking them longitudinally. Some of these programs, like United Health Groups, have pre-positioned at-home tests for their high-risk patients, so that they do have symptoms, they can have an immediate telehealth visit, get the test back in a matter of minutes to a day if they actually sent it in, get referred for monoclonal antibody treatment if they're in a high-risk group and that's appropriate, but otherwise get just very well supported in getting the care they need. That kind of proactive longitudinal approach to care is not something that we're very good at in this country, and I hope we can learn the lesson from what many of these organizations have done to get complications down for their high-risk patient populations, including some that treat patients in low-income areas, high minority populations, and so forth, done a much better job that we really need to generalize as well.
That's a really good point. And, you touched on a lot of different things there. We've been incredibly impressed with the community performance of direct antigen testing for 15-minute answers, really cheap. Abbott Buy Next Now is a great example of that.
Yeah.
And yet you can't buy them yourself as a private citizen, and we lack cheap, effective testing at home when there is elegant solutions that the nation has produced. We just need to do better, it seems. You were calling out Dr. Shuren there. Jeff, did you have a comment?
Yes. So first, I'm going to put in a shameless plug because I'm giving a keynote presentation immediately following this panel. I'm going to talk about two of the lessons learned that I think are going to be pretty important for the future of health tech innovation and safety in peacetime. When we think about, what we do for the next infectious disease outbreak, it starts with a national holistic strategy, and that includes, leadership from the top on down, comprehensive preparedness, a coordinated, adaptable response. And that includes, you need a central point of coordination. I mean, you need leadership in the country that's bought in, but you got to have a level down where there's a place that's really coordinating across the board. You got to deal with logistics. So, for example, on testing, you need to establish a network of testing sites and testing labs, and not just simply everybody, because then you can't coordinate the distribution of supplies as well as you otherwise could. You need an adequate stockpile, like testing supplies, personal protective equipment. You need good contact tracing, good communications, public communications. You got to build that trust, and you got to enforce mandates. Other countries have done that. We just really didn't do that in this country. When you think about tests specifically, there's a lot we can learn from South Korea, who sort of had their epiphany several years ago after their experience with MERS. And one of the things they did, part of their government ICT, invested in companies to have the technology and capability to make tests for infectious diseases very rapidly, so they were prepared for the next outbreak. And in fact, when their government reached out to developers towards the end of January, two of the developers had already started a few weeks before, because that is how they were trained. That's how the partnerships were set up, and they were really out of the gate. And we haven't made those kinds of investments here in the U.S. And the government also de-risked the making of tests. They guaranteed the purchasing, and they guaranteed reimbursement, at the outset for any of the tests that were authorized. And you think about, we did some of those things in vaccine and made a big difference. Big investment in science beforehand and de-risking for the manufacturers. In fact, if this pandemic had occurred 5 years ago, we probably wouldn't have a vaccine today. The science really matured, but there were investments put into it. Another thing that was done, their CDC set up a capability at some labs to do some of the testing of diagnostic tests instead of the developers. So if you wanted to get authorized, the test developer, they did some of the testing, and then it got kicked over to this set of labs under the CDC, and they were set up to do a lot of the clinical testing. And of those that looked good, they sent those submissions over to their FDA equivalent, who then reviewed to determine whether or not to authorize. But that took a lot of the pressure off developers. You had a centralized mechanism for some of the testing that was otherwise hard to do. And so in Korea, you now have maybe about 24 tests authorized. That's what they've needed. In the US, it's over 300 at this point, simply because we had to deal with an all-comers in the absence of those other pieces of a national strategy. And, as Mark said, we don't need a lot of different tests. In fact, a colleague of mine and I wrote a perspective for New England Journal of Medicine that was out a few months ago that talked about this. We really just need to identify a handful of designs and then invest in just large-scale production of those tests would really make a big difference. In fact, a contract manufacturer early on with some of those designs can have tests ready literally in maybe a week or 2 or 3. And we saw that very thing happen when 2 of the contract manufacturers got involved with the CDC tests, IDT and BioSearch. And literally within a 1 week of their starting, it was over 1 million tests. Within 3 weeks, I think it was over 10 million tests were available in the US. You kind of look to the future. So if you expand it, we could do target investments in select and emerging technologies. We can have sort of an NIH RADx style program for sort of facilitating the development evaluation of some of these. And I would quite frankly fund the capability for the government, either by the government or on behalf of the government, to do these evaluations of tests, not just in the setting of an outbreak, but in fact do that in peacetime as well.
Yeah, thank you for those
maybe
comments.
just a comment. If I was going to just raise my hand in an analog way, Joe, if I could, and just say, I want to agree with the comments that we've just been hearing about the importance of testing and having it be available, and maybe just share an experience that we had this past several months on our campuses. We have 10 campuses, so we had little mini experiments in how to bring students back for congregate living, and we could look at our experience compared to that across the country with colleagues in similar circumstances. Almost everyone had all the education virtual this last semester, and we appreciate how quickly the faculty and students adapted to that. We had a real challenge with how many of our students were going to live on campus in the congregate living circumstances that our dorms and student housing provide. And we had different approaches. We saw that in many places around the country, students coming back to campus were associated with huge super spreader events and outbreaks and numbers that were extraordinarily high. Our campus, and I don't know so much about Stanford, I hadn't looked, but I know that there are several campuses that fit into this category as well. The level of positivity on the campuses during the semester was an order of magnitude lower than we were seeing reported so much in the rest of the country. And the plan for that, the menu for that was straightforward. It was testing on entry, isolation or sequestration, retesting, and then reasonable surveillance testing of asymptomatic members of the population, and then isolation and quarantine appropriate, mask wearing, all the sort of basic things that one was supposed to do. And we found that week after week, we had test positivity rates now for thousands of people over this period of time, test positivity rates in the 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 range. Even in the post-Thanksgiving spike, those levels went up, but they were then 0.2, 0.3, 0.4. Again, order of magnitude lower than in their surrounding communities, and an order of magnitude lower than we'd seen in other campuses. So maybe the South Korean method or other methods that we've seen where there is testing, there is isolation and quarantine where appropriate, that people get that information and can use I know we're in Silicon Valley and having a high-tech conversation, but the lower-tech public health measures to keep the amount of virus that's circulating in the community low. Those things worked in the circumstances that we were able to apply them vigorously, and we'll continue to do that through these next several months.
Thank you. Now, I'm looking at the clock, and I think we want to actually turn it to some Q&A. There's a question right off the top that basically says, are we missing an opportunity to collect real-world data on the current vaccine rollout? How is it that we don't have an app or a national database where the patient can report, for example, vaccination status, infection, side effects? I think that also alludes to what other people have talked about. Why don't we have a national medical record number and interoperability of systems? Who would like to address that? Are we missing an opportunity to record and capture that data nationally?
I think I'll start, and then there are probably other comments as it relates to other parts of this question. There is a coordinated effort between FDA and CDC as it relates to understanding safety of vaccines, including traditional methods, which are adverse event reporting directly to FDA and CDC through traditional adverse event reporting systems, as well as a CDC program that I think has an underlying infrastructure donated to the government by Oracle that is called vSafe, where the general idea is at the time of receiving your vaccine, you also get a QR code to register into a system that allows the registrant to then report symptoms and communicate experience with the vaccine across time. And then there's also a third program of activity that's looking at use of large-scale real-world data sets, including CMS data sets, so administrative claims, as well as data sets based on electronic health records and other mechanisms to look at overarching safety event activity, as well as deep dive evaluation when events are identified to understand that situation in more detail, and then also the opportunity around comparative effectiveness. So that's a portfolio of work that the FDA has described on our website and in our advisory committee meetings. Here's the but. So I think that's all very important work, but I see two critical things that we have the opportunity to innovate our way forward in. One is that right now there are now codes that allow for the identification of patients within the context of claims and other data sets. But there still needs to be a lot of work done to try and start linking these data sets. And this is an area that needs continued work and sort of innovation in this space. And I think is really ripe for this community to really think about. And the second thing is that while I think the vSafe program from CDC is really important, it's clear that ultimately many members of our community may not be able to participate, whether this is an older person who's not familiar with QR codes and these kind of mechanisms, or other situations. And so there is the need to think about solutions that go beyond these, and I think that where there's opportunity. The other part of the question is it related to, for example, a national patient medical record number, I think is really important for public discourse and a really important conversation for us to have going forward, because it is going to be sort of critical to our data systems in the future.
Others on the panel?
Just make one comment to build on what Amy said. I did a shift on our vaccination line last week, and the vSafe program is entirely voluntary, and I was just watching how many people actually did it, and there was clearly an age generational gap. Some people knew exactly how you put your phone up and download the code. Others had to be walked through it, and others said they didn't want to do it. And I would say there was probably a 20% pickup, and they're our employees, a relatively sophisticated group. That's one comment. The other is we're currently filling out little paper vaccination cards that remind me of what I had when I went to school 40 years ago, that are provided by the state Department of Public Health, and handwriting in the lot number, et cetera. And then I think another issue that's going to be challenging as we get to the mass vaccination, what Michael Drake was talking about as we move from this funnel of healthcare workers out to the broader population, is how are we going to keep track of what's actually happening, and second doses and all of that. We're currently doing it through our electronic health record. And for those people that we're vaccinating that are not part of our system and therefore not part of our electronic health record, we're creating a unique MyChart just for the vaccination. But that's kind of kludgy when we try to think about how we're going to do this for, in our case, 30 million Californians. So I do think there's got to be some IT digital solutions to some of this.
It is a very kludgy system. Back to the point about real world evidence on the vaccines, there is a lot of work that FDA and CDC will be doing on that. We actually do have one national registry or database on who's gotten vaccines. It's the one that that's maintained by the CDC that each of the state vaccine registries, which all of you at UCSF have to report into in addition to filling out the paper forms. Unfortunately, there is no way for a patient to get access to that data. There is no way right now for a health insurance plan that's trying to keep track of their members, certainly in their financial and business interests to get their members vaccinated. There's no way for them to get access to that data. And similarly, there's no way for a health system, UCSF or others who are trying to manage all of their patient populations longitudinally to get access to the data. So we've got parallel processes going on, one on the public health side that's using that public health data that is connecting to Medicare data, for example. So you'll see some large-scale studies. I think Peter Marks alluded to this earlier, that CMS can help do on their patients. The VA will be doing some studies, where they've got integrated data. But it would be much better if there was a portal connection to health plans, to primary care physicians, and ideally the patients themselves. And we're just not there with a data system like that yet. And for a country like ours that relies on public-private collaboration to get things done, we really need better collaboration on the data systems.
Dr. Mcclellan, a comment on that. That's really on point. I'm not sure that if a Californian goes to a community testing site today and gets tested and they're infected with COVID, that we know if they've been vaccinated or not. With respect to our early comments about vaccine mutant escape, I don't think anybody knows, nor does the state health reporting system have a field for whether you've been vaccinated or not. And having previously run a testing lab, I can't tell you how many tears I've shed over fax machines and sending faxes, which is a lot of the reality of where our data systems are. Sorry, a minor side comment.
I agree.
Anne, did you want to pick out another question?
Yeah, we could jump to George. What is the view of identifying a set of epitopes that could provide the basis for a pan-coronavirus vaccine so that we could prevent the next outbreak rather than react to it?
Tricky question. Panelists?
Yes. Anyone?
Not my area. Again, I'd turn the tables on Joe on that one.
If there's no comment on this one, I think it's a difficult basic science question. I would hope that there are a lot of basic science efforts, and there's some I know of that are trying to race the giant evolutionary virology problem that we're running in the real world with the vaccine in the lab by pressuring viruses to escape from convalescent sera and identifying those mutations ahead of time. But we're doing the experiment out in the real world just as fast as and faster than we can be done in the lab. So I think that a surveillance system out in the real world is probably going to be the one that gets there first.
Yeah, I mean, we do have the capacity now with these new technologies, as we've been talking about, and Joe's right involved in all of them, to quickly develop tests for any emerging, not just variant of COVID, but any emerging viral or infectious disease threat. And then, as we've already talked about on this panel, manufacture and make available those tests at scale, and then hopefully link that to a more effective response system. It does take an ongoing surveillance capacity, but I think we're at a point where technology really enables us to rethink the way we've approached a lot of these public health management issues, where you can imagine both rapid detection, containment steps, and therapeutic development steps happening at a far, far faster pace and at scale than has ever been possible before.
Agree. Anne, did you want to pick out another?
Great. Yeah, along those lines, because I find that question of, how we actually have this national monitoring system and the technology and the ability for us to get there. So there's a question, why are we not using Social Security number in the case of a national emergency, FDA, CDC required to get vaccination, et cetera. But, it's kind of just that question of, there's always been some of that debate about, a health ID, for each individual. So there's a potential of Social Security number, but what is it that's going to really take it for us to get to that kind of nationwide monitoring? Because it's absolutely feasible.
Mark, you want to take this one first?
Well, Amy picked up on this earlier. I think there is a fundamental concern, understandably so, that many people have about even more widespread use of something like their Social Security number now linked to electronic medical records that are all potentially accessible with Social Security plus some other forms of ID or something. So I think there's just a level of nervousness there that's going to be hard to overcome. We have kludges now. You've probably been to your pharmacy and gotten a prescription picked up where you use sort of name, date of birth combination. Far from perfect, but better. And I think there are technology solutions out there, I hope, that can give people confidence that their data, at least key data, can be shared when we want it to be shared, without creating such big public concerns about confidentiality and access to their sensitive medical information.
One other thing that I would add on to this, so in addition to the importance of the public conversation and acknowledging that there are some activities already taking place, such as tokenization and others, I think the other thing that is useful to think about is what's the opportunity for innovation in this space beyond simply making sure that everybody has a single ID. And within the context of the privacy space, we're seeing a fair amount of innovation, whether these are dual level artificial intelligence algorithm development activities, which frankly I don't really understand very well, but have been very intriguing, or the development of synthetic data sets using generational algorithms or other activities. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity, again, for the CERSI community to think about privacy sparing activities as it relates to really helping us go forward with data linkage and data usage in the future.
Additional comments from the panel? Okay. Anne, do we have another question from the gallery?
From Laura Esserman, implications for education, especially for large public universities. How do we continue to educate and prepare the next generation to deal with problems that require so much more interdisciplinary collaboration?
I guess I'll take that, Laura. And I think that there are great implications for our model broadly. So one, the whole the concept of people coming together in the ways that we have traditionally, and that in stadiums or at concerts or other kinds of things where we're all together a lot. Those kinds of things are going to be a challenge as we look forward to ever more of these agents crossing over and posing a risk to us. So we think about that a lot in the concept of residential education, students coming to live on campus. And we all know from our college days, there was the part of the university experience that took place in the classrooms and in the laboratories, the kind of official part of the curriculum. And then there were the co-curricular parts of university. And, if we all were to sit down and say, well, let's write down 10 things we remember clearly from college, some of those would be things that happened in classrooms, but many of them would be things that happened with friends and colleagues and events and things we did that were outside the classroom. And a big part of the draw toward the educational enterprise that we have across the country is for people to come together and associate in these co-curricular activities. In the spring, I teach a class, freshman undergraduate seminar, so 18 and 19-year-olds, and we abruptly came to a halt and then learned to come back together a week or two later on Zoom. And it was really clear to me how much the students missed being together and being on campus, how that was really a critical part of their experience. And so we're thinking a lot about how to do that. And as I mentioned, we've been able to work on having students come together. The one example of this that worked the best, was documented most carefully, was one called Return to Learn at UC San Diego, where about 9,500 students came back to live on campus during the fall, and the overwhelming majority of their education was virtual, but they lived together in single rooms that then turned into pods. And so they had a chance to interact together. And this was they enjoyed this very much more than being at home. And also we found that when we have to rely on broadband, on using electronic means and technology enhanced means to deliver content to students, to be able to interact with them educationally, that if students are in their own homes, there's the digital divide became quite clear to us. The availability to be able to be connected with the class was different for different students, the broadband available in their homes, and the number of the younger brothers and sisters running around and other things that were distracting, we could notice in real time. And so the concept of being able to come to a place where you could have your education supported seemed to have value even in this present term. So I'd say, Laura, that the one change that we are thinking of and looking at, I think as a national community, is analogous to the change in telemedicine use that the healthcare apparatus is saying, that we always had it there, we always could do it, we were doing it more or less, now we'll be doing more of that. I think that will happen in rapid fashion, that we're going to be doing, even when we're able to be back together more, we'll be doing much more technology enhanced education. But ultimately we'll have to, this new normal that we're all rolling to will be a balance between those things that we're able to share in the virtual space and those things where we really find that the value of being together as people is overriding. And we are continuing to evolve forward with that and decide what those outcomes can be. I'm optimistic that we'll get to something that works quite well, but we'll continue to develop that as these months roll on.
Joe, just add a slightly different slant on Laura's question, and that is this issue of how do we teach collaboration. I've been incredibly impressed that at the beginning of the pandemic, how our faculty sort of put the normal things on by which they're judged and evaluated and promoted aside in order to just selflessly collaborate on this project. There are any number of examples, both within UCSF, but across multiple institutions around the country, and for that matter, around the globe. And I think it was Janet Woodcock who said this morning, or someone said this morning, that one of the failures in the clinical trial environment in COVID is the huge number of poorly powered trials that under-enrolled, that were driven by individual investigators who felt the need that if they, under traditional evaluation models, if they're not the principal investigator or driving the trial, then they're not going to get the rewards and promotion and tenure and all of those good things. So I think as leaders of academia, we really need to take lessons learned from this very carefully and think about how our reward systems need to be changed to better promote collaboration across silos. And it was very impressive to me in this last year how that happened spontaneously. But for it to be sustained, I think we're going to have to fundamentally change how we think about reward in academia works.
That's a really good point, Sam, and especially since medical health professionals and researchers found themselves in the front line of this particular issue. I really do think there are some great examples there, but it really means that we need a return to volunteerism, I think is what you're saying. And why don't we have a national Peace Corps of molecular biologists and virologists and health professionals across the spectrum coming to this fight and in a more organized way of volunteerism? I think that's the meaning of your comments, if I take them correctly.
And just a humorous aside, I think we're going to see a huge uptick of medical students going into epidemiology, who are now seen as the rock stars of medicine.
That's true. Joe,
that warms my heart.
We could potentially end, because we're up on time, right? I would love to just hear from everyone, like the one word response of what do you think is the enduring change that comes from this? So I'd love if everyone just has their one thing that we know has forever changed.
Lightning response, we're up against time.
Well, meetings like
That's
this
great,
and the
yeah.
ability to collaborate with people across barriers and regardless of time and space. We'll be doing more of that.
Amy.
Disciplined learning. We're going to take the flexibilities that we've seen and we're going to need to learn from them in a very disciplined way.
Mark.
Sorry
Jeff.
about that. More effective collaboration you've just heard, and hopefully shifting healthcare upstream.
Jeff.
Remote clinical care and clinical trials on steroids. We're going to be digital and integrated. They are far faster now than ever before.
Finally, Sam.
Coordination and reduction of fragmentation in policy making and in healthcare delivery.
Anne.
I am, mine, virtual care. Virtual, I mean, it's such a fun, it's, again, hopefully we can all get the silver lining in this experience and move forward, because there's clearly incredible opportunity for change and everyone's changing right now. So I personally, I tend to always err on the side of optimism. I feel very optimistic by the potential for change here. And I think the world could be much better.
Anne, why don't you close us out too?
Oh, well, that was a little bit my close. Anyways, I thank you for everyone for participating. Like I said, I get such a pleasure out of this meeting every year, and having such thought leaders be able to come together. And clearly, COVID-19 has absolutely changed everything. And like I said, I really do feel optimistic. And my one key takeaway, which is why I wanted to end with what is the enduring change, is I think about, again, this environment that's here at UCSF, Stanford, again, around the world. You have a lot of entrepreneurs listening here who are thinking about what they also want to be able to change. And I absolutely do feel like there is that potential for us to think about how do we use this experience to build something that is going to make it better next time, because it is going to happen again. Awesome.
With that, thank you, everyone. This has been
Thank
a
you.
fabulous panel. Thank you all for your participation and comments. This has been really intellectually stimulating, gives us a lot of food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you.